All right. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the rights and the responsibilities that engineers have in the workplace. So first of all, um, let's talk about engineers' responsibilities. First of all, they have a responsibility to keep information confidential, right? So, for instance, if I'm an engineer and I'm working with a business, I'm going to learn things about sort of how that business operates, right? Even if they're totally relative to my job as an engineer, um, I should keep that information confidential. And so, like, why should I like maintain confidentiality? Well, it releasing information could lead to lots of bad outcomes for the business, right? So competitors may get a leg up, right? Maybe people, if you spill the beans about something, people will be less likely to buy their products, and so they're at a disadvantage. Um, and so data and test results and anything that one learns about the business needs to be kept confidential. Um, so as an engineer, you have a responsibility to your client or to your partner to keep things confidential. Secondly, um, an engineer has a responsibility to avoid various conflicts of interests or conflicts of interest. So basically, the idea here is that if an engineer has two incentives, right, that are both mutually exclusive with one another, well, then the engineer may shirk a responsibility to their primary client or to their employer, and as a result, like execute their job poorly, right? Um, and there may just be something about kind of an issue about transparency here. So if there is a conflict of interest, one might be tempted to be dishonest about it, right? And then we can distinguish between actual versus potential conflicts of interest, right? So, for instance, an actual conflict of interest is where an engineer actually would benefit from, say, undermining their employer, whereas a potential conflict of interest would be like a case where the engineer puts him or herself in a situation that could result in a conflict of interest. And so our author notes that following various company protocol, following government protocol, and following the protocol from the ethical statement of the group of engineers to which one is a part, all of those things can help one navigate this kind of situation. Also, to like talk about things with your fellow employees, right? So two responsibilities, confidentiality and conflict of interest. So maintaining confidentiality and avoiding conflicts of interest. Okay. Next, what about engineering rights? Um, um, our author talks about um, the right to professional conscience. And the idea here is that one has the right to exercise professional judgment in an ethical manner, right? Well, what the hell does that mean? Um, the idea here is that one has the right to do things in the right way, even when the company tells them that they ought not do things in the kind of the right way, right? Or in the way that's laid out in the engineering ethical code, right? Uh, so this is basically kind of a right to a sort of moral autonomy within the workplace, right? And so in defense engineering, right, where you're manufacturing weapons or designing weapons, this right is important because, say, an engineer might have to decline various unethical behaviors, right? Okay. So you have the right to some degree of autonomy, is the idea. And then lastly, we might talk about whistleblowing. So, whistleblowing, our author says, is the act by an employee of informing the public or higher management of unethical or illegal behavior by an employer or supervisor, right? So, I think about there's an episode of The Office. Once Dunder Mifflin is bought by Sabre, Dunder Mifflin starts selling printers, and one of the kinds of printers catches fire after one prints, say, 300 pieces of paper. And so, what Andy, a character in the show, does is he alerts the news media, right? He films the printer, and then he alerts the media to the incident, right? And so he basically whistleblows because he's worried that people are going to be hurt by a printer that like catches fire, right? So we might wonder, we might be morally obligated to whistleblow sometimes. Engineers also will be in situations where engineering does seem to be the right thing to do, right? Um, but we can distinguish between a couple of different kinds of whistleblowing. First, we can distinguish between internal and external whistleblowing. Internal whistleblowing deals with whistleblowing inside of the context of a company, right? And so it feels like kind of lesser stakes, right? Whereas external whistleblowing involves alerting news media or the authorities about some practice that's happening within the company, and as a result, bring attention to the company either from the authorities or from the news media. And then there's also anonymous or versus acknowledged whistleblowing. So bringing some issue up anonymously to, say, a news agency versus saying putting your name on the whistleblowing that you're doing, right? So these are two different ways in which one can blow the whistle, so to speak. And like whistleblowing has its costs, right? So there is a kind of perceived disloyalty when there's a whistleblowing that occurs, right? So in that episode of The Office, Andy ends up getting in trouble for whistleblowing, and we might say that his whistleblowing wasn't necessary. We find out later in the episode because the company was already working on trying to fix that problem with the printer, right? Okay, so when do we need to blow the whistle? Okay, so the author outlines four conditions. First is there has to be kind of an immediate need for blowing the whistle, right? So if your whistleblowing can stop some harm from occurring, it feels like whistleblowing is an appropriate activity or an appropriate response. Next, we might think that one needs to know what's going on, right? One needs to be close to the problem and have like kind of a firsthand experience of whatever the problem is. Next is will the whistleblowing work, right? If the whistleblowing isn't going to actually do anything, then it may not be an appropriate activity, right? So whistleblowing actually has to get up off the ground. It has to work. And then lastly, whistleblowing needs to be a last resort, right? So it doesn't need to be the first option on the list. Rather, it should be like the last option. And we might question that. We might say something like, well, I mean, why think that whistleblowing ought to be the last option? I mean, is it just because it's in your employer's interest? And that if that's the reason why whistleblowing should be a last resort, well, then all of a sudden we're conflating what's in your corporate or corporation's interest or your employer's interest with what is morally right in the workplace, right? These two may actually come apart. Um, and so yeah, anyway. So according to our author, whistleblowing needs to be a last resort. Okay, so during this lecture, we've talked about the responsibilities and the rights of engineers. We've also talked about when it is morally appropriate, according to our author, to blow the whistle on one's company. Thanks.